Chapter 1. It was lunch time, going home time, and the children were milling around in their usual noisy, dawdling way, getting into their coats and hats. But not Dibs. He had backed into a corner of the room and crouched there, head down, arms folded tightly across his chest, ignoring the fact that it was time to go home. The teachers waited. He always behaved this way when it was time to go home. Miss Jane and Hedda gave a helping hand to the other children when it was needed. They watched Dibs surreptitiously. The other children left the school when their mothers called for them. When the teachers were alone with Dibs, they exchanged glances and looked at Dibs huddled against the wall. "Your turn," Miss Jane said and walked quietly out of the room. "Come on, Dibs, it's time to go home now. It's time for lunch." Hedda spoke patiently. Dibs did not move. His resistance was tense and unwavering. "I'll help you with your coat," Hedda said, approaching him slowly, taking his coat to him. He did not look up. He pressed back against the wall, his head buried in his arms. "Please, Dibs, your mother will be here soon." She always came late, probably hoping the battle of hat and coat would be over by the time she arrived, and that Dibs would go with her quietly. Hedda was close to Dibs now. She reached down and patted his shoulder. "Come, Dibs," she said gently. "You know it's time to go." Like a small furry, Dibs was at her, his small fists striking out at her, scratching, trying to bite, screaming, "No go home, no go home, no go home." It was the same cry every day. "I know," Hedda said, "but you have to go home for lunch. You want to be big and strong, don't you?" Suddenly, Dibs went limp. He stopped fighting Hedda. He let her push his arms into his coat sleeves and button his coat. "You'll come back tomorrow," Hedda said. When his mother called for him, Dibs went with her, his expression blank, his face tear-stained. Sometimes the battle lasted longer and was not over when his mother arrived. When that happened, his mother would send the chauffeur in to get Dibs. The man was very tall and strong. He would walk in, scoop Dibs up in his arms, and carry him out to the car without a word to anyone. Sometimes Dibs screamed all the way out to the car and beat his fists against the driver. Other times, he would suddenly become silent, limp and defeated. The man never spoke to Dibs. It seemed not to matter to him whether Dibs fought and screamed or was suddenly passive and quiet. Dibs had been in this private school for almost 2 years. The teachers had tried their best to establish a relationship with him, to get a response from him, but it had been touch and go. Dibs seemed determined to keep all people at bay. At least that's what Hedda thought. He had made some progress in the school. When he started at school, he did not talk and never ventured off his chair. He sat there mute and unmoving all morning. After many weeks, he began to leave his chair and to crawl around the room, seeming to look at some of the things about him. When anyone approached him, he would huddle up in a ball on the floor and not move. He never looked directly into anyone's eyes. He never answered when anyone spoke to him. Dibs's attendance record was perfect. Every day his mother brought him to school in the car. Either she led him in, grim and silent, or the chauffeur carried him in and put him down just inside the door. He never screamed or cried on his way into the school. Left just inside the door, Dibs would stand there, whimpering, waiting until someone came to him and led him into his classroom. When he wore a coat, he made no move to take it off. One of the teachers would greet him, take off his coat, and then he was on his own. The other children would soon be busily occupied with some group activity or an individual task. Dibs spent his time crawling around the edges of the room, hiding under tables or in back of the piano, looking at books by the hour. There was something about Dibs's behavior that defied the teachers to characterize him glibly and routinely and send him on his way. His behavior was so uneven. At one time, he seemed to be extremely retarded mentally. Another time, he would quickly and quietly do something that indicated he might even have superior intelligence. If he thought anyone was watching him, he quickly withdrew into his shell. Most of the time, he crawled around the edge of the room, lurking under tables, rocking back and forth, chewing on the side of his hand, sucking his thumb, lying prone and rigid on the floor when any of the teachers or children tried to involve him in some activity. He was a lone child in what must have seemed to him to be a cold, unfriendly world. He had temper tantrums sometimes when it was time to go home, or when someone tried to force him to do something he did not want to do. The teachers had long ago decided that they would always invite him to join the group, but never try to force him to do anything unless it was absolutely necessary. They offered him books, toys, puzzles, all kinds of materials that might interest him. He would never take anything directly from anyone. If the object was placed on a table or on the floor near him, later he would pick it up and examine it carefully. He never failed to accept a book. He pored over the printed pages as though he could read, as Hedda so often said. Sometimes a teacher would sit near him and read a story or talk about something, while Dibs lay face down on the floor, never moving away, but never looking up or showing any overt interest. Miss Jane had often spent time with Dibs in this way. She talked about many things as she held the materials in her hand, demonstrating what she was explaining. Once her subject was magnets and the principles of magnetic attraction. Another time it was an interesting rock she held. She talked about anything she hoped might spark an interest. She said often she felt like a fool, as though she was sitting there talking to herself, but something about his prone position gave her the impression that he was listening. Besides, she often asked, what did she have to lose? The teachers were completely baffled by Dibs. The school psychologist had observed him and tried several times to test him, but Dibs was not ready to be tested. The school pediatrician had looked in on him several times and later threw up his hands in despair. Dibs was wary of the white-coated physician and would not let him come near. He would back up against the wall and put his hands up, ready to scratch, ready to fight if anyone came too close. He's a strange one, the pediatrician had said. Who knows? Mentally retarded, psychotic, brain damaged. Who can get close enough to find out what makes him tick? This was not a school for mentally retarded or emotionally disturbed children. It was a very exclusive private school for children aged 3 to 7 in a beautiful old mansion on the Upper East Side.